unfortunately, Scott did have another meeting that was scheduled a couple months ago, so he was not able to make it. I know I'm not nearly as entertaining as Scott, but I will attempt to tell you a little bit about him and why he's running for re-election for the 28th District State Senate seat. Scott is a lifelong resident of York County. He graduated from Dallastown High School and attended college to actually be a diesel mechanic, but decided to pursue starting his own businesses shortly after. He has had several types of businesses over the years. His first started with mowing lawns, followed by owning some rental properties, some laundromats, 2 waste companies, a trucking company, and somewhere in the middle of all that, he was actually a bail bondsman, which if you ever have the opportunity to talk to him about, he has some really interesting stories from those days. Scott is currently the president and owner of York-based waste and recycling company Penn Waste, and also the president and owner of KBS Trucking, which is based out of Thomasville, Pennsylvania. Scott has been involved in politics for over 30 years on the state, local, and national levels. And in addition, Scott believes in supporting the community, which has helped make him so successful. He's heavily involved in the nonprofit community, having served on numerous boards and providing time and resources and guidance to a lot of the local nonprofit organizations. On March 18th of 2014, Scott was elected by write-in to serve out the remainder of our late State Senator Mike Wall's term, and Scott is running for re-election for a full 4-year term. Scott's top legislative priorities are property tax reform. He is a co-sponsor of Senate Bill 76, and if it came up for a vote today, he would vote in favor of the bill. Pension reform. The impending public sector pension crisis has a direct impact on property taxes. In the past, the easiest way to find money to cover the rising pension costs was to raise property taxes. This is an unsustainable form of funding, and Harrisburg needs to get more creative to solve the pension crisis. Prevailing wage elimination. Prevailing wage artificially inflates the cost of construction projects and ends up costing the taxpayers more for public sector projects due to the lack of competitive pricing. Although it doesn't seem like this would have a huge impact on property taxes, the savings associated with using competitive pricing would help keep costs down over the long term, in turn keeping your property and other taxes down. And paycheck protection. Paycheck protection legislation would prohibit taxpayer-funded automatic deduction of dues and campaign contributions from government union members' paychecks. Now let me tell you really quick about the Scott Wagner that I know. I know a lot of us are used to seeing the really rambunctious and outspoken Scott Wagner that loves a good challenge and occasionally the limelight. But I want to tell you about another side of Scott. I started working for Scott in 2010, and Scott was the first adult in my life to spend any time teaching me about fiscal issues and educating me on these really important conservative fiscal issues. Education is something that is very important to Scott, and he's one of the most well-read people that I have ever met. And regardless of what your opinion is, he just wants people to be educated on the issues. He is also the most compassionate person that I have ever met. There's a great quote that I think really sums up Scott's mentality, and that is, "To whom much is given, much is expected." Scott believes in giving back to this community, which has helped make him successful. I take it personally when I hear anybody say anything bad about Scott. If you don't agree with him, that's one thing. But when anybody attacks his character, I take offense to that. Because what he does when no one is looking is who he really is. The Scott Wagner that I know donated coveralls to a Penn Waste employee's son and his unit who were serving overseas when they couldn't get the federal government to pony up the money for the coveralls. A couple months ago, we had a lunch at a restaurant in Camp Hill. About 20 National Guard members walked in to have lunch. Scott asked the waitress for their bill, didn't say anything to them about picking up the tab, but thanked them for their service when we were walking out. The Scott Wagner that I know works with local veterans organizations to put together baskets to be sent to our service members who are currently serving overseas. The Scott Wagner that I know donated $15,000 to help finish the Veterans Memorial Gold Star Healing and Peace Garden for our fallen soldiers when the organization needed help raising the rest of the money to finish the project. We were at a local barbershop not too long ago dropping something off when a man walked in. He was really upset because of a friend of his who was a single mother. Her daughter had dropped her glasses on the playground and she needed a new pair of glasses and she couldn't afford to buy them. Scott immediately offered to help, and within a week the girl had a new pair of glasses. I could go on all night with examples like this. Nobody except those who work closely with him and know him on a personal level know that what he does when no one is looking. He has helped countless organizations and people in this community, and I really don't think anybody has any idea what is asked and expected of him on a daily basis. He is one of the largest charitable givers in York County. The responsibility that he feels to give back to our community is something that has inspired me and many others around him. That is the Scott Wagner that I know, and I would appreciate it if you would keep that in mind when you see the negative TV ads that the Philadelphia Union bosses are airing once again as of about 4 hours ago. I believe they went up on air. And you know, we would really appreciate your vote on November 4th. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. As you know, sometimes we get so divided in politics that we don't come and talk to each other. And what unites us as Americans, I think, is much more important than what divides us. I'm a retired United States Navy Master Chief Petty Officer, which is an E9. I was a weather forecaster, but I served over 27 years, 22 years of those on active duty. And that service is something that's shared by people all across the spectrum, all different races. I wouldn't say all different ages, because as you know, when you get a little bit older, it's time to retire. But I'm very happy to be here to reach out, learn the issues that are important to you, and hopefully you'll know a little more where I'm coming from, and hopefully we can together start moving this country forward, because like you, I see that we have very big problems right now, and we're not getting good solutions, but I think we can if we work together. In addition to my Navy career, I have a niece and nephew who are now adults, but when I started, they were kind of teenagers, started in politics, that is. And I realized that I had to step forward because the world that's coming at them is a very difficult world. And they need to have time to set up their families and get a job, so it was my time to step forward, even though it's not natural for me to run for office. Some of you may feel the same way about being involved in politics. It's not something natural, but you believe in it. So my nephew now has a 1.5-year-old boy who is one of the cutest boys in the world, probably tied with your grandkids. And my niece is going to have a baby in January. So that's the kind of stuff that unites us. And I'm not going to get into the issues I normally do at this point, but one of the things that I find very interesting about politics is at the local level, we do tend to talk to each other more than at the state and national level, and I think that's important. And it was, I think, about 2010, I was at the polls, and at the polls you can have good conversations with people on the other side as long as you generally avoid politics. You got to be careful. But I was talking to a young lady who was very excited about the Tea Party movement and about the conservative movement coming forward because she really wanted to get some of these issues handled. And one of the things I've seen is elected officials are not where I think a lot of the average people are. And that's one of my concerns, and that's one of the things that I want to figure out. And maybe tonight we can start a little bit of the dialogue, because she was very concerned about corporate welfare. And I agree completely with her. I think we give way too much money to corporations. Yet I see people in Harrisburg, people in Washington, giving grants, to this day, giving grants to corporations. That's one of the reasons we're having trouble. And when people say we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem, there is a spending problem. I think there's a revenue problem too, in that we're giving breaks to certain people and we're pushing the property taxes and paying for a lot of the stuff down to the middle class, which is not sustainable. So that's one of my major concerns, and hopefully kind of through a dialogue we can figure some of this stuff out. My three big issues are restoring state funds for education, because education is the opportunity for our kids. That's one of the things that made our country great. That's one of the things that made us a scientific powerhouse. It's one of the things that helped us win World War II, made a great military. So I really think that we have to get back to getting a great education system for our kids. Creating good jobs, because as you know, these young people, my niece and nephew, you have to have a job that sustains your family. And right now, we're struggling. Our pay level for the middle class is stagnating and even falling behind. We've got to go back to creating good jobs. One good way to do that would be transportation, funding our infrastructure. We had a transportation funding bill. It came a couple years later than it should have, and it's slower than it should be in spending to restore our roads and bridges. But if you want to give people good jobs, do something for us, keep our roads and bridges from crumbling so it doesn't cost more, that's one of the issues that I think is really important, the good jobs for people. And then the last major issue ties into the first one, which is that property taxes. We all know in York County, the property tax increases are unfair and unsustainable. I think we're going to differ on what to do about it. Each bill that has been proposed to fix that has major mathematical problems. And that's one of the things that I find very frustrating about politicians and people in government, is sending something up as a solution, but it has major flaws, so it's not a solution. You can't get it passed through the legislature because it's not a solution. The solution I see is very different. We have corporations in the state that have been getting more and more tax cuts and special breaks. And we taxpayers, you and I, cannot make up the difference. We've had, since 2003, corporations got about $850 million in tax breaks. Now it's over $3 billion. It's really getting near $4 billion if you listen to some people's accounting. That is killing us. We have had $30 million state grant to Comcast to build a skyscraper in Philadelphia just this year. $8 million to Glatfelter grant, taxpayer money, yours and I. $1 million to Weiss. That's where some of our problem is. We're tilting the field to the community, to the corporations. Is that one more minute, or is that, okay. And we're asking taxpayers to make it up. To fix the education funding and stop the property tax increases, there is a funding formula problem that has harmed York County. That needs to be fixed. Governor Corbett signed legislation to have a commission to look at that, but that's been a known problem. And also getting the state share of funding for education up to 50%, because counties like York County are being hammered at the level of you and I. We're writing the bigger checks while corporations are getting those breaks. The state can't afford to fund education. It can handle the pension crisis if it asks corporations to pay a fair share. Not more than their fair share, but if they pay a fair share, you and I will have a fair share, and then we'll have the opportunity of education for our kids. We'll have good roads and bridges, we'll have good jobs, and our property taxes will be under control. So like I said, thank you very much for this invitation. I look forward to your questions. My position on abortion is this, that the government should not be in the decision process. The decision about abortion should be between a woman, her physician, her family, her God, and then the state needs to stay out of it. The thing about the Common Core, that is something that is not a mandate. It is a suggested core, and Pennsylvania did work on adapting the core standards. They did adopt a set of standards, and Governor Corbett recently said he wanted to go back and revisit that. I believe it was Representative Grove who was upset by that because Pennsylvania did go through and adopt its own standards. So you need standards for education. and the question is where they're going to come from. The National Common Core is not a national mandate. Therefore, if Pennsylvania chooses to take a set of core standards, I support that. You have students that move from one place to another. Military families will do that. Families seeking economic opportunity will do that. So as long as it's Pennsylvania making up our own mind, which it is, I support a set of standards for education.
So was that a yes or a no? I didn't quite get that. So
So
you're saying we should adopt that or not? I know
we should adopt the standards that Pennsylvania makes.
So the state or government should control our children's learning.
You need to have standards, and if Pennsylvania adopts a set of standards for our children, yes, I believe that's a good thing. Yes, corporations push costs down to their customers, as they should, because if we allow corporations to impose costs on society, every one of us is paying for every single corporation, but I don't buy from Pepsi. I don't, maybe you're a Coke drinker or whatever. So Pepsi customers should pay the cost that Pepsi imposes on us, on our country. They use the roads, they use water, they use the court system. So that's why I think there is a fair share, and it should be each corporation, and I think that is part of what I see as the free market system. The second part is why can't schools make it on the amount of money they have, if I got that correct. Schools in our area have not had an even deal. We have had in York County less money than other areas in the state. Our property tax problem here is very noticeable, but in other parts of the state, they don't have a problem with property taxes because the funding formula has favored them. And the York County Republican delegation noted that several times, and in 2012 they actually sued the state because the funding formula harmed York County, specifically because our population is growing and the other parts of the state that was losing students still kept the same amount of funding. So we're falling behind on that. If you're a city, we had a special education funding formula that assumed that every school district had the same percentage of special education students with the same needs. We know that's not true. We know you concentrate poverty and you concentrate special needs students in cities or in poor school districts. We see that a little bit with Hanover. So that's why we have a property tax problem. I can't tell you dollar for dollar where we could use X million for this school district, X million for that, but I know that we have to value education enough to pay for it. And the real problem is that Harrisburg is responsible for funding an adequate system of education. So there are 203 House members who are responsible and 50 state Senate members who are responsible for that funding, but they can cut it. I mentioned the Restoring the State funding. The state used to fund about 50% of the share of education. It's now down to 34%. So they cut the amount of money to school boards and leave the school boards with a choice. Cut teachers, raise taxes, or do both. And our school boards are trying to keep things together, and they've been doing both in most of the districts. And they're doing it across the state. 70% of the school districts in the state have been increasing class sizes. And I think the percentage of school districts raising taxes are 62%. So basically, the people at the bottom of the food chain are being left with crumbs to deal with. They're being starved of resources. So this is not a problem across the state. Some places are doing very well. But that's why we don't have the funding. And it varies differently from different school districts to different school districts. York City got a cut of $1,000, a little bit over $1,000 per student a few years ago. The wealthiest school districts, or a school district in a wealthy county, got $36 cut per student. So we're not comparing apples and oranges, and we're also looking at a system that pushes responsibility down to school boards and lets the people making the real critical funding decisions and setting the standards without any accountability. And that's one thing I want to change when I go to the state senate. I think that's where the responsibility lies. My father's a retired teacher, so I've got a fondness for teachers and an appreciation for what they do. He came up in the ranks when I was very young, in the days when we did not pay teachers a lot. He had the 2 jobs, and he would come, and I remember vividly him correcting papers at the kitchen table, because I was very young once, and I saw a paper and I drew on it, and then I realized it was a school paper. I was so embarrassed. Thank goodness, he was good, and I'm still here, and I'm forgiven. But teachers work hard, and they care about their kids, and they are professionals. They have to go to, the 4 years bachelor's degree. There are a lot of continuing education requirements. So when they come together in a union, that is so that they have the bargaining power, so that they can get a little bit of equal power. Because if you're there by yourself and you're negotiating with the school board, you may not get the fair, not just pay, but job conditions. School board may not understand how to educate children, and the teachers, they're the educators. Their voice needs to be heard. So I support education unions, I support unions. Are they perfect? Heck no. No human institution, no human being, of course, is perfect. But I think they're a very important part of our process. I think it's a difficult question because the definitions, my large and your small. My philosophy of government is that government needs to be limited. And it needs to be effective, and it needs to spend the least amount of money. It has to be very respectful of the fact that taxpayers' money is what's funding it. I think education is a very core function of government. I think infrastructure is a very core function of government. I think that motorcycle helmet laws, I don't care. I don't need a law to tell somebody to wear a helmet or not. I think that's hopefully a common area that you have. But when it comes to clean air and clean water, as a citizen, if somebody's polluting our air, our water, remember back in the late 60s, we had rivers on fire. We citizens can't fix that by ourselves. If corporations or the people who are polluting refuse to clean up their act in a literal sense, that's when we need government. The Constitution, you like history. As you know, the federal Constitution came about because the Articles of Confederation, which had much more power for the states and a lot less power for the federal government, was not effective. So I think we need an effective federal government. We need active, educated citizens who know what their representatives are doing in Washington and not doing, look at what I say, not at what I do, because I alluded to earlier the fact that what I see is a lot of tax breaks for corporations on both the federal and state level. My opponent has actually defended that $8 million grant to Gladfelter. He's defended the hotel tax, which I'm not necessarily against the hotel tax, but I'm surprised that he defends it because it allows York County to increase our hotel tax from 3 to 5% for partly government to use to help boost tourism. So sometimes I don't see the lineup of what some of our politicians are saying and what they're doing. And I agree that that's where some of our spending problem is. If corporations are not going to pay taxes, in Pennsylvania, 70% of corporations do not pay the corporate net income tax. And on the federal level, a lot of corporations are not paying taxes by the time they do all their deductions and take their breaks. If they're not going to be paying taxes, why are we giving them grants? You and I can't afford that. That's where some of our breakdown is. If you're a small businessman, how can you compete against Comcast when they got a $30 million grant from the state? And politicians are sometimes guilty of exaggerating. I actually downplay that story for the sake of brevity. This is where it's nice to have extra time. The rest of the story is they get $10 million from Philadelphia for the same skyscraper. And then they're going to get, it's 4.3 or 4.5 million. That number may be slightly fuzzy, but it's north of 3 million. To create jobs. Excuse me, Comcast, $12 billion profit in 2012. They don't need help creating jobs, and they certainly don't need yours and my help. If we've got 30 million from the state plus 10 million from Philadelphia, why isn't that money going to schools? Why are they coming at us for property taxes from there? That's where I think I have some common ground. And that's what I'd like to work on, because if we could fix that, then we would be making some progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you to Ed, I should say, Mr. President, for having me here. I'm from the northern part of the county, which is, unfortunately, sometimes seems like it's completely disconnected from the rest of York County. So it's good for me to be down here. Last time I was here was when I was running against 4 other Republican candidates in the primary. So it's nice to be here without them nipping at my heels. But tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about myself. For those who don't know me, again, my name is Mike Regan, and I am a first-term representative in the State House. I represent the 92nd District. I'm from Galesburg, where I live with my beautiful wife, Fran, of 25 years, and our 4 children. This year I have the unique distinction of having a child in elementary school, middle school, high school, and college. I have my daughter Shay is a sophomore at Penn State. I'm looking forward to going up there on Saturday to watch us beat up on the Buckeyes a little bit. I'm hopeful. But it's been a really interesting, well, let me first give you a little bit more of my background, since some of you don't know me. I graduated with high honors from Albright College with a degree in criminology. I am a retired United States Marshal. I spent 23 years in the United States Marshal Service, and I was commander of the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force for many years, and then in 2002 I was appointed by President Bush and confirmed by the United States Senate to be the United States Marshal for the Middle District. I served in that position for 9 years. Upon my retirement in 2011, I became part of the corporate administration as the Deputy Inspector General, which is the Inspector General's office is the agency which fights waste, fraud, and abuse in state government, and specifically in the welfare system. When the dominoes fell, that Todd Platts announced he would not seek re-election, and Scott Perry decided that he would run for that seat. It was a very difficult decision. It was interesting going to my wife at that point in time and saying, I'm thinking about quitting my job and running for an office that I may or may not win. And I think she either looked at her checkbook and thought, how the heck are we going to do this? But we made it work and ran for office, and I'm so honored and proud to serve the 92nd people of the 92nd District. My first 2 years in office, I was able to write 9 bills. I have to write them all down here, excuse me for 1 second. 5 of those bills passed through the full House. 3 have become law. 2 were passed on their own merits. One was an amendment which dealt with school security. It was amended into Senator Scarnati's Senate Bill 10, which dealt with funding for retired police officers to work in our schools as safety officers. I was very proud of that. One bill, which, you know, the law enforcement background and a public safety background, so one bill I'm very proud of is I was very shocked to find out from an incident that occurred in my district where 5 beautiful young elementary school girls were stalked, were terrorized by 2 individuals who were arrested for this crime, but ultimately received a probationary sentencing and actually qualified for a much lesser sentence. So after getting wind of this, I wrote a bill that said if you stalk a child, if you lure a child into a motor vehicle or a structure, you will receive a 10-year prison sentence. And that passed through the House unanimously and became law. Governor Corbett signed that several months ago, so I'm very happy and proud that that took place. Since I have limited time, I'll talk about 2 other bills which I propose. One restricts welfare benefits to Megan's Law violators. I know from my time in the U.S. Marshal Service that many times, well, let me stop and go back a little bit. In 2006, President Bush signed the law, the Adam Walsh Act. And that gave the U.S. Marshal Service the investigative authority over those who were Megan's Law violators, sex offenders, who cross over state line and don't re-register. So we had many of those cases we were working, and we discovered that many times people would be required by state law to register under Megan's Law, but they would not stay in compliance. They would report faulty data. They would lie about where they're living. They'd lie about what car they were driving, things like that. But they were still receiving welfare checks. So I wrote a bill that said if you are a non-compliant sex offender required to register under Megan's Law, that you would not receive welfare benefits if you were out of compliance. We know for one thing for sure is that through statistics that if you are a Megan's Law violator and you are in compliance, you're very unlikely to reoffend. But if you're out of compliance, the chances that you're going to reoffend are much greater. So my bill, I think, was kind of twofold. Number one, it's chipping away at the huge welfare deficit we have in this country. We spent $31 billion, which is above and beyond what our general fund is. Our general fund is $29 billion. We're spending $31 billion with federal and state subsidies on welfare. I can tell you that the waste, fraud, and abuse in the welfare system is beyond comprehension. They estimate it's anywhere between 2 and 11% of welfare spending is waste, fraud, and abuse. I would dispute that number, but even if it is, it's still hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And I can give you examples, but I'm going to try to get through this. So, additionally, from my background, I saw that many times when we made arrests, especially drug fugitives, we found in their possession large sums of cash, typically a firearm, narcotics, and an EBT card, or instruments of welfare. Very frustrating for me as a taxpayer at the time, and I took steps once I got elected to start preparing a bill, and that bill is currently in committee. It basically says if you are a convicted drug dealer, you can no longer receive welfare. So I'm really grateful for that. Thank you very much. Listen, I consider myself a conservative Republican. I may not be as conservative as some people, but I do believe that we should have paycheck protection in this state. I do believe we should do our best to solve the pension problem. I am a co-sponsor of the bill, Brian Cutler's bill for paycheck protection and Mike Tovash's bill for pension reform. I voted for House Bill 76, which calls for the elimination of property taxes. I will support Senate Bill 76. So I think I'm in line with my constituents in 92nd District, which mean it's easy for me. It's a good place for me to be as a representative because I don't have to put my finger in the air every time an issue comes up. I think my values and the things that I hold dear are in alignment with my constituents, with at least a great number of my constituents. So this has been a very rewarding experience for me. Long hours. As a matter of fact, my wife just texted me, asked me if I could come home and help her tuck the kids in. So after I'm done speaking here, I'm gonna bug out, but it's my great honor and pleasure to be here, and it's an honor, a true honor, to continue to serve. I feel like I have a servant's heart. What I loved about being a U.S. Marshal was I thought I was able to positively affect people's lives by just working hard. And I feel the same thing in this job. So I don't have an opponent, so I feel very fortunate that I'm going to have 2 more years to serve. And I really appreciate your attention tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions. Well, very simply, I think it's wrong.
And how do we resolve
Well, listen, I think one thing we can all agree on in this room is those who are truly in need of welfare benefits should receive them. I mean, there are children who don't get enough to eat. There's elderly citizens who don't have, they have, very large medication bills, pharmaceutical bills, and they need care. Those people should have the money. But it is a problem. One of the things I sat with the former Deputy Secretary of Welfare, named Tim Costa, one time. And he said, if a mother of 2, single mother of 2, who's out of work, if she receives every benefit that she's entitled to, health care, SNAP benefits, cash assistance, whatever she can get, she's going to qualify for a lot of things. If she makes use of everything that she can get her hands on, she'd have to get a job paying her $75,000 a year to have the same deal. Now, if you're an uneducated person, you might be able to go out and get a decent job doing something if you can work with your hands or do whatever, do a blue collar job. But to give up what you have through welfare to go work at McDonald's or another minimum wage job, you don't must be doing your family and your children a disservice. So it's the problem's deep. But one of the things I found out when I got to the Inspector General's office is Governor Rendell removed a lot of the safeguards that had been put in place to keep people who maybe didn't qualify or maybe shouldn't have qualified for welfare benefits, which brought the rolls way up. And recently we had a forum for senior citizens who wanted to know about welfare fraud. So I invited a friend of mine, Luke Miller, from the Inspector General's office, and another gentleman named Clint Eisenhower from DPW to come speak to them. And one of the things that Mr. Eisenhower said was that even today, they receive pressure from the federal government to sign more people up for welfare. They question why we don't have more people in Pennsylvania receiving welfare benefits. So it's a problem. It's a big problem. So all I can do is to just start to chip away. And I do, Bev McGrath, who is the secretary currently, she's just a wonderful person. She's walked into this huge monster that we call DPW. It's gigantic. It's compartmentalized. The systems don't communicate well with each other. And it's a shame when people don't use their ingenuity for good things. But there's many people who are gaming the system. Who figured out how they can beat the system at DPW, and they're receiving, money for, I remember one of the cases we worked on, there was 2 registered nurses. They had a combined salary of $100,000, and they were receiving food stamps. They just figured a way to game the system. So we also know that, and I'm probably going too long, and I apologize, but we also know that, it's like, in Pennsylvania, it's like, to say there's not much welfare fraud, it's a very small percentage, and I've heard a lot of people say that. It's kind of like saying there's no voter fraud. And the reason there's no voter fraud is there's nobody investigating it. One of the big frustrations we had at the Inspector General's office was the fact that we don't have enough guys out there investigating. We had like 14 guys who covered the whole Northeast. And one of the facts is the Inspector General's office pays for itself. If you hire a welfare fraud investigator, the average that a welfare fraud investigator with the Inspector General's office will do in a year is $1.1 million. That person makes a $35,000 a year salary. So, my thing was, let's hire them all. As a matter of fact, when I saw the budget come through this past when the governor first, the governor's going through trying to cut, and I don't want, this is no way a criticism of the governor, but when his first budget came through, the proposal, I saw the cut, the 4% in the Inspector General's office, and most state agencies received a cut, so it wasn't anything unusual. He was trying to balance the budget, and I understand that. But, I went around to my colleagues and I had them sign a letter saying, please don't make this cut, and they corrected it. It went to the appropriations chair, Bill Adolph, and they restored funding to the Inspector General's office because, as this number gets bigger, this $31 billion gets bigger, I think we have to do due diligence to make sure that we are properly investigating welfare funds. So, listen, I don't want to sound like I'm being a hard guy, but we have to preserve those benefits for those who are truly in need. And, I'm going to continue to work hard to make sure that happens. Good question.
What's the question?
What is it?
Drug testing. There was a drug testing that passed in 2010, which dealt mildly with those who had a drug background or a drug conviction. They had to pass a test. But it should be for anyone who applies for welfare. That should be the way it should go, and that's something we're going to look at. Unfortunately for me, part of being a new representative is learning the ropes and trying to figure out the politics within the politics and trying to be able to advance your agenda in a way in which you can best benefit your constituents, but also the most efficient way. I'm working on that, and I'm going to get it. I'm going to work on a lot of these things. Linda mentioned something earlier that it is true, is there's a lot of portions of the state who don't want it to change. Hold harmless agreements are in place. School districts who've seen loss in school population, student population, have not seen a decrease in funding. Their property taxes are low, they don't want this. So those are the Republicans you have to be concerned with. The ones who, if they vote for this, they're going to get in trouble with their constituents. That's a problem. House Bill 76 and Senate Bill 76 initially were pretty close. I think now they're slightly different. I think the math on Senate Bill 76 is tighter. House Bill 76, even its strongest supporters realized that there were problems there with the math. But I think Senate Bill 76 might have a better chance, but again, we're always going to be buttoned up against that hold harmless thing. We need to work on the funding formula for education before we can really, I think, get a fair way to fund our schools before we're really going to be able to deal with the property tax issue.
Well, if they don't deal with it soon, they'll be in a place like York, Pennsylvania, which isn't going to have the properties to support the school system that they're trying to support. And that's why I'm a supporter of going bankrupt. Let the city renegotiate everything, with the unions and all that, because the pensions, the money that they need for the pensions is where the money's going to pensions. It's not going
salaries
to
and pensions, like 70% of the typical schools.
And for the people that say that, well, we don't have a tax problem in other parts of the state, well, that's great, but this House Bill 76, Senate Bill 76, all it does is eliminate school tax for everybody, and then puts it on the backs of everybody that spends any money in the state, whether it's sales or working. I mean, it sounds like a much fairer way to support our schools. But then I agree, some of these other things, measures like prevailing wage, that's a horrendous thing. When you talk about doing the roofs on some schools, that would be $84 million they're budgeting, and you get the prevailing wage in there and it's $120 million. I mean, anybody with common sense, and whatever's going on that's wrong today is all contributed to the legislature that we have here today and 10 years from now, before. In 1971, when they put this pension increase, guaranteed the whole deal where you wouldn't have to sacrifice anything, and if you're in the union, you don't worry about it. You retire, and you get more money when you retire than you do when you're working. I mean, it's so unfair, and if the legislatures can put these laws into place, why can't they take them out?
Yeah, well, I agree. It's the unions are very strong. We were sitting there, and I was sitting next to my colleague in the House floor last week, and he was looking around, we had a break, and he was looking around, he goes, look, it says truth and justice and liberty, it's written around the walls, and there was 2 empty spaces. He said, what do you think we should put in those 2 spaces? I said, PSEA and AFSCME, because they really do, they mobilize, and they're very effective, and they have a sympathetic ear on the Democratic side, and unfortunately about 15 members on the Republican side that keep a lot of really substantial legislation from rolling. Very frustrating for me. Look, nothing against the unions. I think there was a real need for unions in the past, but I think things have changed, things have evolved. And look, this is interesting. This came up in our I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee. There's a law in Pennsylvania that says it's illegal to stalk, to harass, and to threaten the use of weapons of mass destruction unless it's a labor dispute. Now think about that for a second. That law applies to everyone except for the unions. And so Ron Miller proposed a bill saying, let's make that illegal for everyone, not just the unions, which seemed to make perfect sense to me. And I sat in that public hearing, and the union members were going berserk over that. They wanted the right to stalk, to threaten, harass, and threaten the use of weapons of mass destruction. My U.S. Marshal brain was going into overload. I was like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that this exists in Pennsylvania. So it's tough. It's tough. But listen, I'm willing to fight the fight. I'm willing to do everything I can do to fight the fight. 53 years old. I'm not going to cower. I'm going to fight it, and I'm honored to represent you. Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Representative Regan, and all of you here this evening. Appreciate you coming out, and appreciate your caring, because a lot of folks would rather be watching the World Series tonight or basking in the lights somewhere at home, but the fact that you're here says a lot about who you are, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here with you. So I want to just take a minute tonight on a balmy fall night in beautiful central Pennsylvania and ask you to think for a minute about a cold, dreary January morning, waking up and seeing on the television an image of the day before Tom Wolfe putting his hand on a Bible and taking the oath of office as governor of Pennsylvania, and realizing at that very minute that any chance of paycheck protection was a thing far past, that any opportunity to get elimination of the school property tax either through 76 or some other means would remain only an idea, that school choice would never happen, that any of the reforms so important to all of you would remain for at least 4 years, simply something that you'd fight for and work for and strive for, realizing that they simply wouldn't happen. And what would happen would be that the taxes of each and every one of you and me and our neighbors and friends would go up dramatically. One study is now saying 3 times what they currently are. That state spending would be as profligate as it was under the Rendell administration, or worse, because that's been the rhetoric of this entire campaign. You folks live here in York County. You probably know Tom Wolfe better than folks in other parts of the state. What most people in Pennsylvania know right now about Tom Wolfe is that he drives an old Jeep and he has a nice family. And for the Democratic primary this spring, that seemed to be enough. His opponents challenged him, but only at the margins. They talked about him outsourcing jobs, but only a little bit. They They talked about the record of his company, but only every once in a while. And so he was able to skate through the Democratic primary relatively unscathed, carrying with him a margin of victory relatively unheard of in Pennsylvania history. Carried every one of the counties. But now, in the closing days of October, people are beginning all across Pennsylvania to ask the fundamental question. And that is, how high is Tom Wolf actually going to raise our taxes if he happens to get elected? Because he's been absolutely unwilling to tell people the specifics of his plan to raise taxes. We know he's going to do that. We know he's going to dramatically increase spending. We know why he's going to do it. It's been discussed, I know, because I've been sitting in the back here this evening at some length today. Because he wants to spend more and more money. His basic solution to every problem and need facing the Commonwealth is simply spend more money. Not have programs that are more accountable, not have management that is more efficient, simply spend more money. And I was amazed the other day. I was talking to a very intelligent young lady. And she asked me a very fundamental question. And I was bemused by the question itself. She said, well, Charlie, where does the government get its money? She was dead serious. I wasn't even quite sure how to respond to that. But I suggested to her that it wasn't like the federal government where they turn on printing presses. They get their money from you and from me and from no place else. And so when we hear stories about we're going to spend this much more and that much more and this much more and we're going to spend dramatically over here and dramatically over there, the simple realization is that you and I pay for that. And more, our friends and our neighbors are saying we are simply not convinced that Tom Wolf is ready to be governor of Pennsylvania, is competent, and his views are not the same as ours. And we're concerned about our taxes going through the roof. And so an election that a couple of weeks ago looked like it might be a much wider margin than it is today is now one that's tightening. And we hope and we pray that over the course of the next few weeks, you will help to take the word to people all across this little corner of Pennsylvania. That if you believe that your life would be a little bit better, if your taxes were a little bit higher, you have a clear choice. But if you believe that what we've heard here tonight, that limited government is a better form, that fiscal responsibility makes more sense, that allowing people to keep more of their hard-earned money and decide for themselves and their families how to spend that money is better, and if when the family budget gets bigger and state government's budget doesn't, that we might all be better off for it, then there's another choice as well. But here's the one concern, and that is that there is still a significant portion of the electorate that is saying, in effect, a pox on both of your houses. I'm not going out to vote. Ladies and gentlemen, I heard that 2 years ago. I was amazed then. I still am. Some of my friends have said, I don't think there's really any difference between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. So I'm not voting. And all I can say to my friends that held that view is, really? Because Barack Obama himself has said, in one of the few occasions when I've agreed with him, my policies are on the ballot this November. And they are. And in Pennsylvania, they have the words Tom Wolf written right next to them. This is a very clear choice that we have. Please don't let anybody say, I'm not voting. Please make sure that every one of your friends and neighbors and family, folks at church, folks at school, folks at work, wherever you can find them, get to the polls on November 4th and vote for Tom Corbett and Jim Pauley, because they have done a good job. I know that there are folks that don't believe they've done a perfect job. I happen to be one of them. But don't let very good be the enemy of perfect or vice versa. Please don't let that happen. This This administration came into office saddled with a structural debt that Ed Rendell and his taxman Tom Wolf had left for them of over $4 billion. They were able to do, as Representative Regan said, balance that budget without raising taxes. I hear folks on the other side of the aisle saying, well, our economy's headed in the wrong direction. Really? Unemployment in this state went from 8.1% when Ed Rendell left office to 5.7% today, actually a tiny little bit lower than that earlier in the summer. That's the wrong direction. 180,000, keyword, private sector jobs created under the administration of Tom Corbett. Not public sector jobs, private sector jobs. Because all of us know that small business and the private sector is where job creation is going on today. Those are opportunities for real growth, for family-sustaining situations across this great Commonwealth. Tom Corbett has been a good steward of state government. He has put us on a pathway to prosperity. He has led in every way and in every fashion. He deserves our votes and our support on November 4th. And I will say this, I would be happy to answer any questions that I'm able to. I'm here tonight, obviously, as a surrogate and a representative, so I don't want to answer questions for the campaign and the candidacy that are beyond my scope. But I'd be happy to take any comments, questions, concerns, or comments that you'd like to make. It's a great question, and I will concede that you are correct that Tom Corbett hasn't always done the greatest job of bragging about himself. He said so himself. He's a man that is not a politician. I often chuckle myself at the irony of the fact that I talk to an awful lot of folks who say, I wish we didn't have so many politicians in Harrisburg and Washington. And then when they get somebody who is truly a non-politician, they kind of think that maybe he's not political enough. But Tom Corbett, although he doesn't brag on himself a lot, has a lot to brag about. I mentioned just a moment ago what's happened with unemployment in the state. When Tom Corbett took office, the #1 issue in Pennsylvania was jobs. And he has fostered a climate, an economic climate and conditions under which private sector jobs could grow. 180,000 new Pennsylvania jobs over the course of his administration. Unemployment plummeted far below the national level from over 8% under Ed Rendell and his taxman Tom Wolf to significantly under 6% in 4 years. That's a very significant record of accomplishment. Maybe they haven't bragged enough about it. He's allowed, for example, the Marcellus shale industry in Pennsylvania to thrive and prosper in ways that it should, with the safe and responsible development of natural gas, something that folks on the other side of the aisle want to shut down completely. You're aware, by the way, that the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania has an official resolution to put a moratorium on the development of natural gas in Pennsylvania, like New York. I mean, one of the craziest ideas you could possibly imagine. And you don't hear candidate Wolf inveighing against his own party's position on that issue, for example. Instead he says, well, let's just tax them a little bit more. They're already taxed to a very significant extent. I think that the fact that Governor Corbett has recognized the gold mine under our feet with the natural gas industry and the safe and responsible development of that precious natural resource, which allows home heating costs to go way down dramatically, so make sure I'm nodding, you know what I mean, to allow Pennsylvania to not only be energy independent, but an exporter of energy. Now the #2 developer in the entire country. It's a God-given, godsend in so many ways because it allows manufacturing to again take preeminence nationally here in Pennsylvania. Those are things that Governor Corbett did over the course of the past 4 years. Probably most significant, he put the state back on a sound financial footing. Mike Regan will tell you that he's happy that he got to spend the 4th of July with his family on vacation rather than sitting in the halls of Harrisburg, as used to be the case under the previous administration, because they passed balanced budgets on time. Yeah, let me get to the education question first, and then I'll just come back for 1 second to the gas issue. Mike Regan gave you a very quick answer to the charge that Tom Corbett cut education spending, which is?
A big lie.
Big lie. A very big lie. The fact of the matter is, Ed Rendell and Barack Obama cut the education funding in Pennsylvania because it was quote-unquote stimulus money, all of you know about that came here, and every school district in the state knew that it was going away, and when it did, they said, he must have done it. The fact is that today, Pennsylvania is spending more on basic education than at any point in history. That's a simple fact. You can tell anybody that, look them in the eye and say, go look it up. But I think the more important issue there is what you alluded to after that. And that is it simply how much money we spend by which we measure educational success? Is it simply, if you spend X number of dollars, you're doing a good job, and if you don't spend X number of dollars, you're not doing a good job? Or is it some accountable measures, some performance measures that will tell us how well that money is being spent? And that's what Governor Corbett has really pushed at very, very hard. And the converse to his position, that of Mr. Wolf, was seen in the first debate. And if any of you didn't get a chance to see the first debate, please, you can go on PCN or one of the other websites and pull it down. Take a minute to watch it. It's one of the most telling opportunities for people to see both candidates side by side, up close and personal, without the little note cards that other people wrote for them to read off of. And the question that was asked of Tom Wolf by the moderator was this. You say that we need to spend more money on education. Yes. How much more would be enough? There was this very stoned silence. And then he gave an honest response, which was, I don't know. And that, ladies and gentlemen, to me, ought to close the case.
He doesn't care because we're going to pay for it.
Well, that is an absolute metaphysical certainty. Is there any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just going to make 2 comments, if I may.
Sure.
First has to do with Governor Corbett and the Marcellus Shale, which you were talking about. I have come across some, what I would consider very educated voters, and one in particular owns a company in town who was adversely affected by the cap that was removed in the transportation tax. And he said, well, why is the cap being removed on that, and then you do not have an extraction tax? I was fortunate enough to be able to have a brief exchange with the governor about that issue. And I think one of the things that came down to it is what Governor Corbett has done does not necessarily fit well into a 20-second soundbite.
No, it doesn't.
He has worked very hard, and his policies are, when you listen to him and he is able to articulate his point, you understand it. And the cap that was removed on the transportation tax bill simply removed an artificial cap that was in place. And then as far as the Marcellus Shale is concerned, this particular individual was impressed with the fact that Tom Wolf was proposing an extraction tax. What he did not realize is that we already had an impact fee in place.
Which is an extraction tax.
Which is an extraction tax. And he was comparing us to Texas, which does not have a personal income tax, and he was not aware that Pennsylvania had the highest corporate net income tax rate. So, again, he was not able to compare apples to apples, and again, it was just an item that didn't fit within a soundbite. That was point number 1. And you don't need to comment on this, but the next point that I do want to make is, I am getting angry in York County particularly, that we seem to be conceding the point to Tom Wolf that he's a very nice guy. He might be a very nice guy, but you know what? Tom Corbett's a very nice guy too, and we need to keep that in mind when we go to the polls November 4th. Thank you.
Thank you. And well said. Let me just pick up this for 1 second, because I think it is important for you when you're talking to your friends and neighbors to reflect on what the gentleman just said, and that is that we do have the severance tax. They call it an impact fee, but it is a severance tax. And Governor Corbett has said numerous times that if folks that are crying about Pennsylvania not having a severance tax like Texas or Arkansas or West Virginia want to trade tax systems with any of those states, he'd be glad to. The point is that, as the gentleman said, they don't have the corporate net income tax that we have here. They don't have personal, they have a whole wide range of taxes that we charge on the Marcellus shale industry and other industries here in Pennsylvania. Believe me, we're not a low tax state. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just have a kind of to use you as a sounding board here in a way. I've thought about what Tom Wolfe has done, and he doesn't speak in specifics. And it reminds me of what happened with Obamacare and why you don't exploit that situation. Here was the American Congress saying to us, well, we'll find out what's in the bill after it's passed. So I have not heard Tom Corbett saying, well, you know, this is very similar to what happened with Obama Don't Care.
Well, I think you just wrote the next campaign commercial, sir.
And Tom Wolfe doesn't show up on radio shows. I mean, he just doesn't want to answer questions because I don't think he has answers. And the answers he may have are going to point to the fact that we're going to pay exorbitant taxes in this state.
Absolutely. And I love the point you just made. I mean, I think that in many respects is a great television commercial for the Corbett campaign. You know, the old Nancy Pelosi thing, we've got to pass it, so we'll see what's in it. Basically what Tom Wolfe is telling you is, you've got to elect me so you can see how high I'm going to raise your taxes. Well made points, sir. Thank you.
One of the reasons that I'm swaying toward Tom Wolfe is because
your taxes aren't high enough.
my taxes are what they are. I mean, they're always going to be there.
Your family would be better off if they were higher.
Yeah. But
maybe not death by taxes.
Yeah. But you know, I think of locally, they closed one Chick-fil-A and they opened up two, and yeah, that's jobs. But those aren't good jobs. And I look at what Tom Wolfe did with his company and his profit sharing, and those were good paying jobs.
And how many jobs do they have at the Wolfe Company today, sir?
It doesn't matter.
It does matter. It certainly matters. How many jobs do they have there today? Do you know?
You're talking micro.
No, I'm not.
You're talking
You're
macro.
saying, well, let's talk macro. How many jobs did they have there 10 years ago?
Oh,
I mean, the point of no, I think this is really important. If you're going to say, look, the jobs that are being created in Pennsylvania aren't great jobs. The jobs at the Wolfe Company are jobs that are disappearing by the hundreds, in droves. This is a man that says, you know, I want you to see my record as a small businessman. Not many years ago, they had roughly 600 employees there. Today, they have roughly 200. Would he tell us that's the right direction he wants to take Pennsylvania? I mean, let's be very blunt about Tom Wolfe. Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas, once criticized George H.W. Bush for being born on third base and thinking he hit a triple. Tom Wolfe came out of the womb on home plate and thought he had circled the bases twice. I mean, the record at the Wolfe Company is not one that I think anybody, particularly here in York County, want to raise up as the standard by which you run a company.
I'm not really sure when he had 600, when the Wolfe Company had 600, if that was...
Within the past decade.
Okay, and I know Tom Wolfe left the company, sold it when it was profitable, it went to being unprofitable, bought it back, made it profitable again.
And you know how he bought it back. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole history here, but I think it's very, very important.
Do tell. How did he buy it?
It's very, very important to have all the facts about the Wolfe Company out on the table.
Okay, how did he buy it back?
With the use of public money, taxpayer money.
What, you got a grant?
It got through the either Peasers or SIRS, I can't remember which one it was, and which boards he had political friends and allies.
And that was under Corbett's administration?
That was under the Rendell administration.
Okay, because I understood he was with Rendell as the treasurer.
It was the Secretary of Revenue.
Secretary of Revenue. But getting back to what I was initially trying to say was, I was born Republican. When I turned 18, I enlisted in the Army. I registered Republican. I was a Republican all through college, and it wasn't until after that I realized that it seemed to me Republicans only really care about those who have 7 figures, those businesses. I've talked to many people about it, and I don't want a redistribution of wealth, but small businesses can't survive on the same stage as big businesses. They can't. Walmart comes in and everything's made in China. Caterpillar moves out of York, PA, and you saw today their stock goes up, since the Dow soaring 200 points. You know, these are things that, they're realities of this world, but it seems to me that what used to be the Republican values of capitalism, going way back to Hamiltonian economics and support of infant industries, it's gone.
Well, let me say this. The record of Tom Corbett with respect to small business is very clear. And the jobs that are being created in Pennsylvania today are almost exclusively, not totally, but almost exclusively, through the small business sector. That's the great job creator of Pennsylvania. And those are the people that Tom Wolf would choke out and choke to death through his tax policies, even though they're not specific yet. We know enough to know that if he were successful in being governor, the tax policies that he put into place would kill and strangle an awful lot of small businesses. The fact of the matter is, simple economics tells us that if you tax something, you get less of it. And that, unfortunately, is the mantra of the Wolf campaign and would be the hallmark of a Wolf governorship. More taxes, more spending, less economic development, less economic growth. We tax the things that we shouldn't be taxing, and we'd be strangling and impeding the things that ought to be growing. A healthy, growing economy is what Tom Corbett has been doing successfully over the course of the past 4 years. I don't think there's much question about that.
Charlie, the criticism of Corbett over the last couple of months that I've heard is he wasn't a great communicator. And I guess I'm thinking he's not a great communicator with the Senate or the House, in particularly the Senate, because it seems like there's a lot of bills there that he would pass that would save a lot of money for the Pennsylvanians that aren't getting through the Senate because of a Mr. Pelagi. And that just came up from Scott Wagner not that long ago about this gentleman is like a Harry Reid. He's like an obstructionist. He won't let certain bills go through that would be good for the state. And the bills that are going through are like minutia in my mind. They're not benefiting financially the people that live in this state. And then it crossed my mind, you know, Corbett was Attorney General before he became governor. He put a lot of those guys in jail because of their corruption. And I wonder if those friends are still there and they're going to impede Corbett from being a success. And are they going to do that if he gets in again?
Let me say this about the criticism of Tom Corbett as not always being the greatest communicator. Part of that criticism has come from Tom Corbett himself. I mean, he stood in front of the chamber dinner a couple of weeks back and said, you know, if there's one thing that I haven't done the greatest job of, it has been communicating both externally with the people of Pennsylvania and internally with the legislature. I think that Governor Corbett, over the course of the past few months, has shown a decidedly different approach with the legislature, particularly on the issue, for example, of pension reform. He went out this summer and campaigned all across Pennsylvania, taking his case directly to the people, using the bully pulpit that's afforded to him as governor. I think you're going to see a lot more of that in his second term. He's already said, I'm going to call these guys back, Representative Regan, in the special session and force them to take a hold of and wrestle the bull down on pension reform. And that is a crying need, whereas his opponents said, we don't really have a pension crisis. Tom Corbett has said, yes, we do. We're going to do something about it. So I think the second term of Tom Corbett will be a decidedly different approach with the legislature, and I think a much more positive. Is there some lingering, I don't know what the word would be, resentment, I guess, is that a fair characterization of what we're saying in the General Assembly because of the prosecutions of some of their fellow members? I suspect there probably is. Mike can tell you.
I don't really think so.
He doesn't think so? Okay.
I think, if you don't mind. Yeah. Doesn't he have a pen and a phone? What can he do the same as the president?
I just answered the question, and I really feel that many, at least the Republican members of the House, were glad that there was a little bit of a house cleaning and are happy that we are now scrutinized, we're looked at, we're relied upon to do things on the up and up. And I think
We're losing.
that culture was brought to Harrisburg. I mean, there was a lot of things going on that should have never gone on. I mean, staff members campaigning, bonuses being paid for campaign work to stay in place. I mean, all kinds of just horrible things that everyone knew was wrong, but it was a culture. The culture needed to be broken, and there was one guy who was brave enough to do it. It was Attorney General Tom Corbett. And this is one more thing, if you don't mind. I knew Governor Corbett when he was Attorney General, and I was U.S. Marshal. Our cases sometimes overlapped. And I kind of, what people criticize him for now is what I like about him the most. Is he's a guy who rolls up his sleeves and goes to work. He doesn't brag about himself. He's not like Governor Rendell, who had 5 press conferences on his way to the press conference. He's a guy who does the job. Now, is there a political side to that job? Yes. And is he the best politician out there? Probably not, but I know he's a good husband, he's a good father, he's a good grandfather, and he's a great governor. And he's got a pedigree of public service. Sometimes I think that, in politics, you get these guys who are very wealthy and say, you know what, I want to be governor. That'd be nice. It'd be nice to be called governor. I think that's what's going on here. We have a guy who's dedicated his life, a guy who could have made a ton of money in the private sector, very bright guy, and his pedigree is beyond reproach, who wants to be governor. And I'm convinced because he wants to do it for all the right reasons. Not to be called governor, but to make Pennsylvania better for his grandkids, our grandkids, and our kids. Sorry for that, Charlie.
I think you saw great answer. I wouldn't try to improve on that. Any others? Well, thank you for having me tonight. One more, so go ahead.
I just want to say one other thing. I mean, we all have to weigh who we want to vote for here. But I don't understand if you vote for somebody who's never given you specifics as to what he stands for or what he will do, how you ever can come back to that person and say, well, you said you were going to do this. And Tom Corbett has laid out those specific things, right or wrong, whatever you think about it. But you can come back to that and you can say, hey, this is what you said that you were going to do. But Tom Wolf doesn't even want to do that. I mean,
It's called accountability, and that really is what we should insist upon in all of our leaders, and that's up to us. So let me close by saying what I said at the beginning. Imagine the world of January 2015 if Tom Corbett is not successful in getting reelected, and what it will mean to the issues that are at the heart and soul of all of you, and what you believe are the pathways to a better Pennsylvania for all of us. And imagine the far different world if Governor Corbett is successful and can take 4 more years to continue what he's been doing and to march through that litany of issues that I talked about at the beginning of this evening. Please take the next 13 days, or 12 days at this point, and talk to every friend, neighbor, family member, person at church, person at work, person at school, wherever you happen to find them, and tell them how critically important this election is to the future of our Commonwealth. And please, not only get out to vote on November 4th, but take every person you can find to the polls so that they can do the same, and ask them to join all of us in voting for Tom Corbett and Jim Fulton. Thank you for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
With all the comments, I really need to put out a little bit of information, a personal side that I have related to Tom Wolf. I think it was 2008, about the same point in time where I think he was trying to sell his business. I don't know if that's the right time frame. But at the same point in time, my wife was at a point where she worked for Wolf. She worked there for about 4 years. So the first time she was there, as she worked one part, I think it was the lumberyard, which is no longer in business. He got rid of all that. At that place, she worked for a gentleman who gave her all the cell phones. And she took that and she started saving money. She saved him about 30 grand a month. So then she got kind of moved to another position, promoted. She got into the place where they were doing returns, SAP and stuff like that. So she started modifying the process and made that very streamlined. So she did very well in that position. So then she gets to a different position. And this whole time, Our daughter, who now is 15, has Down syndrome, so she would have to go to meetings with doctors, therapists, whatever. She did so much work there, and then she had to take time away from work. This time that she took away from work was FMLA, and they allowed her to do that, so she didn't have to take PTO. After a certain point in time, they switched that. Made it very difficult on my wife. She had to take the PTO, and she ended up using it all up. Knowing that she would use up all that time, she went to Tom Wilk and asked him. She said, listen, this is what's happening, and as soon as I use it all up, I'm going to end up either being sick myself or my son or whatever. I'm going to get written up because I won't have PTO left, paid time off. Well, it did happen. She did get written up, and he did nothing about it. He said at the time, go to HR. They'll take care of it. No problem. Didn't happen. She was harassed for months. We went to a lawyer in York. The lawyer basically dragged his feet. We found out later that maybe there was some communication going on there. We had to go to Harrisburg to get a lawyer, $2,000. Wrote one letter, her boss got off her back. Harassment for 6 months. They sent a letter to us saying, what about a separation agreement? We're like, okay, fine. So we sent back a figure, thinking, I don't know why he would even do that, but all right, fine. 2 weeks later, the whole department was laid off. About a week later, they started hiring people back. Not my wife. The guy's not a nice guy. So, I know who will help me with it. Another part about Tom Wolf is I just got an email today from somebody showing me something on YDR editorial where they interviewed Wolf, and he says that the taxpayer should be paying for sex changes for state officials. I think it's state officials, I'm not sure exactly what. Why should we pay for that? We're broke. It doesn't make sense. So, with that, that's my story. I'm sorry about that. The last person, is anybody here for Scott Perry? You're here to speak for Scott Perry? No. No, okay. I can't answer for him. Sorry. So that's pretty much our candidates, meet the candidates forum, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and speaking and answering questions. I just want to go over about 5 minutes worth of something for our next meeting. Find my notes again. What we want to do next meeting on December 4th is basically start a school board project. 4 years ago, we had committees for the 16 school districts in York County, and people got together and they started going to school boards, but it kind of phased out. Now, we learned some things from that, and what we'd like to do is get people to do that again. Get people together in each school district and start, working together, going to school board meetings, and then have all of the leaders of 16 school districts get together and start working together and collaborating. What we want to do ultimately is to start to watch what's going on, get candidates to run, and figure out how we can change the culture on the school boards. I think we can do a lot. We have some people that have been on school boards recently, have learned a lot, and can teach us what we need to do. But what we want to do is we want to better prepare than we did last time, better organize, coordinate, like I said. If we have complaints about the school boards, we've got to get involved. I'm doing a lot of things right now. I can't actually go to a school board meeting every first Thursday of whatever month. But I don't believe everybody else can do that either. So if we have 5 or 6 people get together in a little committees for each one of the school districts, we don't have to do that every night. One person can go this month, and next month somebody else can go. And we can pull together and start talking about what's going on. And then start educating people. We can get this information out. You'll be surprised what's going on right now. Our school boards have a reputation of doing the will of the business manager and union directives. If we get on there, we start to see that and we start to change that. Some of these things are good intention, but there's obviously unsustainable, financially crippling initiatives that are not necessary. In one school district, they're giving laptops or iPads to all students. Why do they need that? There's no reason. That's a cost to us. So I'd encourage everybody to come out. We're going to talk about Common Core, we're going to talk about some other things, and then we're going to try and work on getting some groups together. If anybody's interested tonight, I have some sheets that basically
I've already documented all the school board members that are on for each school district, who's up for election, and most of them in 2015, and we're starting to work on, are they conservatives, are they not conservatives, are they doing what we want them to do? So if anybody is interested, or in any one of the 16 school districts, please